Yes, Jim Saleam in Sydney. I'm speaking this evening with Dr. Tom Sunic in Croatia. Good evening, Tom.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for your invitation. And I would also like to extend my regards to our friends down under. And I am certainly at your disposal. And hopefully by the end of this year, or possibly earlier, probably a little bit later, I might join you for a couple of lectures that we have already agreed upon.
Indeed, so we have, and we've looking forward to having you when we nut out the technical problems. I'd like to start, Tom, by noting that I understand that you were banned from Twitter recently. And is that a result you feel from the scope of your work?
Frankly, I will tell you in one sentence, and then I can, of course, expand on it in an hour or 2 hours if needed. And I guess, quite frankly, I'm not surprised because there are quite a few colleagues of mine who have been banned for quite some time. I was simultaneously banned with Kevin MacDonald, with James Edward, with some of our people I'm affiliated with, some of the academics, but I'm not surprised. In fact, it doesn't come as a surprise given the fact that even some prominent names like Trump, like some politicians were banned for quite some time. I wrote to them, so did Kevin MacDonald, and I inquired about the reasons, the motives for the banning, and I'm still expecting the answer. And I don't think it was any particular peculiar motive on the part of Elon Musk. I think it was probably one of their agents, some computer agent who probably dislikes our works. But this is just a wild speculation, and I wouldn't like to go into it. But of course, I'm a little bit concerned about this because this tells you again and again, and I guess we can expand on this a little bit more. There is a general form of, I call it, intellectual inquisition going on in the so-called free world. And I'm not surprised at all that one of these days we might be rebanned again on some different platforms. But these are just wild speculations. I'm not giving up. Yep. And I certainly will write more letters, complaints. I'll file some complaints and I will see what happens. All the more as I wrote to the Twitter administration, in fact, I never engaged in any quote-unquote hate speech, in any violent rhetoric against any minority. I was basically posting book covers and book reviews, also my reviews, my essays from the Occidental Observer. It was basically a high-level intellectual stuff. But I guess since we all fit into this imagery of white supremacists or neo-Nazis, as we are all called, this is just a defamatory statement, and I'm pretty much used to that. And I know this lingo very well from the communist Yugoslavia, so I'm not surprised that this is now reused by I call them the thought police, or let's call it virtue signaling police, both in the United States of America or down under, let alone in Germany and elsewhere. So again, we could talk about this a little bit, about this very sophisticated form of, what can I call it, digital repression spreading out now all over the Western Hemisphere in the name of so-called democracy and free world. And I guess I would certainly urge your listeners, your viewers, our friends down under, hopefully I'm going to see them shortly, to study first and foremost the etymology of the words, and to particularly study the liberal newspeak, the liberal lingo, not just the morphology of the words, but also the way how those words are used and how those words are misused. As a matter of fact, just in passing, I need to tell you, I'm just working on my new piece for the Occidental Observer. I presume it's going to be quite academic and very sophisticated piece because I use quite a few citations in French, translated in English, of course, in German and English, where I'm specifically talking about this new modern mythology used by the liberal opinion makers or system opinion makers, as I said, particularly in Germany, but now, of course, you can feel the pinch of it also down under. And I guess we got to focus a little bit more on this, language police, so-called in the free world, and study not just their motives, but also the linguistic facets of it. I don't know, I don't want to repeat myself, Jim. I always, when I, for instance, come across the expression like the hate speech, I always wonder who actually coined this expression in the first place, because this is a nonsense word. This doesn't have any linguistical basis. And it's even hard to translate it into foreign languages, because the word, the expression that came out in the early 80s on American campuses, and now it has entered into the jurisdiction and the penal code of different countries, but it's basically a nonsense word because it's abstract. And I'm afraid of abstract words because they're not specific enough. And we had exactly the same expression back in communist Yugoslavia and the jurisdiction, rather, in legislation of the Soviet Union. You didn't have exactly the same word, but you had, will come to my mind, govor mržnje, hate speech, or you had the term expression the bourgeois speech, the bourgeoiski govor. And I guess now we have the recapitulation or reenactment of the same lexical terror, if I can put it that way, all over the Western Hemisphere. As I said it at the beginning, Jim, I could summarize that in one sentence, but I would probably need a whole lecture of 1 hour, and possibly I'm going to deliver a lecture on
I was going to take you to a matter that in some ways emerges from the former communist Yugoslavia, when the European Union and the United States recognized the creation of a country called the Republic of Kosovo. And as we've all seen recently, there is extreme ethnic tensions in Kosovo at the moment, and the possibility of actual warfare. What do you read into this crisis? What do you see?
All right. Well, first and foremost, let me tell you, I wrote extensively about this nationalist question in the Balkans, and not just in the Balkans, but in Central Europe and Eastern Europe as well. And I must say that before I start answering directly to your question, that in view of what's going on now in Eastern Ukraine, the war, the conflict between the Russians and the Ukrainians, we have to ask ourselves a question, a rhetorical question, cui bono, who benefits from it? It's certainly not the Ukrainians, it's certainly not the Russians, or for that matter, we can apply the same question to the conflict between the Kosovar Albanians and the Serbs in southern Serbia. Now, let me first be a little bit more specific as far as the Kosovo enclave is concerned. Of course, the Kosovo has been recognized as an independent state by not all, but quite a few of European Union countries. I think Spain has not recognized, Russia has not recognized Kosovo. I just need to tell you something, and I need to backpedal a little bit. As far as the Kosovo independence, or putative or tentative independence was concerned back 30 or 40 years back, the American State Department, I know it firsthand, or for that matter, even the dissolution in Yugoslavia, they were adamantly opposed to it, and nobody even dreamt, nobody even hallucinated about this country called Kosovo. I guess to an average Australian, this may mean nothing. But now, of course, given the fact that there is a large military basis, one of the largest American bases over there, of course, they have interests in lauding, in praising the Kosovars, and mostly Albanians live there, 80%, 90%, and of course some Serbs. Now, this reminds me a little bit, if I can draw the analogy, if I can draw the parallel with this big love for the Ukraine. With all due respect, we have friends, Ukrainian nationalists, but I'm always a little bit suspicious of this sudden burst of friendliness and burst of Western love for the Ukrainians, because keep in mind that even Bush, not the senior, he was also opposed to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He just wanted to change the regime and make it capitalistic, but when he was asked by Gorbachev back in the late 80s, I remember quite distinctly, I was teaching political science back in the States, and he was adamantly opposed to the Ukrainian independence. But now all of a sudden we have the Slava Ukraini, which means literally Zig to Heil to Ukraine. And again, I'm drawing the parallel again with the Kosovo, which is now like a child, a golden child. There's a better English expression that will come to my mind. A darling of the United States and, of course, the European Union. So everybody talks how Kosovo needs to be preserved. And again, keep in mind, Kosovo is adjacent to Albania proper. Albania is it's all Albanian. And it's located right near Greece, right near Macedonia as well. It's a very sensitive area. And I'll keep in mind, Serbia, of course, doesn't recognize Kosovo. I don't want to take sides here, but I would certainly like to your listeners to evaluate, ascertain before taking sides who is right and who is wrong. And I guess probably the Albanians are correct. Probably they're right. I'm just looking at it from a pure realistic perspective. Why? Well, because they have a huge demography. The demographic growth is the highest, relatively speaking, the highest in Europe, as opposed to the Serbian demography. The birth rate is very low, almost none. They're disappearing as the people. So again, before we start taking sides, before we start blasting the Serbs, or for that matter, blasting the Albanians, we got to also keep in mind that demography, also racial demography, is a very important factor in evaluating the future developments, not just in that part of Europe, but in all parts of Europe. Now, as far as the potential conflict is concerned, it's hard to say. I think that even the recent demonstrations in Serbia were to a large extent stage managed by some foreign powers, Western powers, because as you certainly know, again, when we talk about the Kosovo and we talk nearby Albania, also keep in mind, and I hope I'm not too academic and too hermetic in my speech, but I got to tell you that Serbia is the only country in Europe which has still good ties with Russia, which has not broken the ties. There are still direct flights from Belgrade to Moscow on a daily basis. Serbia has not imposed sanctions on Russia. Of course, Serbia is a small country, 8 million people. It's not a big deal. And of course, Serbia is not very much beloved by Western decision makers, be they in Brussels or be they in Washington, D.C. So I guess this makes an additional reason why Serbia is, well, to some extent demonized, to some extent viciously attacked in the foreign media. Again, this may sound, for me, I'm a Croat. I am ranked as a Croat nationalist. I just want to stay objective. And I certainly, by the way, I was a guest at the Serbian Institute for European Affairs, very academic think tank in December last year, and I was very well received, despite the fact that those folks know very well where I was coming from. But I had this discussion exactly like I'm having with you now, all tuxedo type of old coat and tie discussion, and I'm sure you can find it if some of your listeners, if they are familiar with the Croatian or Serbian language, they can find it on the YouTube. And I was discussing this issue about the Balkanization, not just specifically of Serbia and Kosovo, but the Balkanization of the United States of America, the Balkanization of the European Union, and of course, the Balkanization condensed and compounded by the racial, what we call ethnic big replacement going on the daily basis.
Could I just ask you a question here? It seems to be that the United States does not recognize those two republics declared in the east of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, but they accept this proclamation in Kosovo. How would that have been received both by Serbs and by Croatians?
Well, again, it just depends who defines the double standards. Now, keep in mind that if I can just go backwards and step backward a little bit. Back in 91, June 21st, yes, almost, what was that thing, 91, Secretary of State, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, James Baker, when he toured Yugoslavia, the war was just simmering in the air. He said adamantly, and you can read in the New York Times, you can also read in the New York Times my response to it. That was in June 91. You will find, I'm quoting him, that the United States will not endorse the unilateral separation of Slovenia and Croatia from Yugoslavia. Now, 30 years afterwards, Croatia is a very important and solid pillar of NATO, the NATO southern flank here in the Balkans, for obvious political and realistic reasons. So again, we can now speculate about the morality and ethics of the State Department, or for that matter, about American foreign policy, even as far as the Kosovo is concerned. They didn't give I don't want to say a damn, they couldn't care less about this, quote unquote, small country in the Balkans. And now, of course, they're very much interested in this democracy and free speech, diversity in Kosovo, just as much as they're very much interested in lauding and praising Zelensky and Ukrainian nationalists to the skies. So you're quite right. Now you have the Russians declaring Zaporozhia and those Luhansk, those two new republics, as part and parcel of independent states, which are likely also to become part and parcel of the Russian jurisdiction, including like Crimea, like the peninsula Crimea. But then again, they're just acting like the Americans acted back in 35 years back. So I guess it's just a matter of real politics. If I can just step a little bit further, keep in mind what you read in the Australian media and what you read often in anti-Russian, anti-Putin American media, that Ukraine is a very diverse country, in the sense not in a racially diverse, but there's a large Russian and Russophile population in this region, in those two regions which were declared independent now, including Crimea. Crimea is, well, of course, the Ukrainians claim it back, but it's a heavily populated country by the Russians. There, of course, there are still some remnants of the Tatars, and of course, there were lots of ethnic Germans who lived there prior to the Second World War. So it's a very sensitive area. We can go back now to the Crimean War, 1852, 53, which was a very serious one. And again, it's, I know for an average, even average academic teaching at the Melbourne University or down in Sydney University, this may sound like, what is that's not important. But those little pieces can sometimes provoke, they can ignite a major conflagration. So with this thing going on now in the eastern Ukraine, let alone sort of a similar scenario, we can discuss about this, if you allow me, in the Kosovo and possibly even Bosnia and Herzegovina. Keep that also in mind, nearby, just 20 miles from where I live, This can again spark a major conflict, and I guess we wouldn't be interested in those fratricidal wars going on. And I keep asking myself, cui bono? Cui bono? I'm certainly not a big friend and big fan of Putin, and for that matter, Russia. But as a matter of fact, I also have to admit that Washington, D.C. is 8,000 miles from Zagreb, where I live right now. I'm just observing the American embassy is half a mile from where I live, and the airport is about 2 miles from right here on the outskirts of Zagreb. I'm sitting here on the porch. And again, so it's a small country, and keep in mind that Moscow is less than 1,000 miles from Zagreb. And so far so good. We haven't been in conflict with Russia. And again, I have no particular, qualms about being attacked by the Russians, but you never know. Of course, when push comes to shove, when the state of emergency occurs, you have to take sides, especially if you're a small country like Croatia. So it's an irony of history. Now, again, let me just recap, and I just want to underline it once again. Back until 91, the State Department, I know it firsthand because I was lobbying there quite often as a former expatriate Croatian were fighting for the dissolution, or rather the Confederate Yugoslavia, were fighting for freedom of speech and so on. And the answer of the State Department was, we want to preserve the unity and integrity of Yugoslavia. No way of endorsing the renaissance of Croatia, which had a bad reputation going back to the Second War, because, as you certainly know, Croatia was a firm ally, the firmest ally of the National Socialist Germany until 1945. And even when the Berlin fell in May, the third Croats still kept fighting against communists and so on. So yes, we have this stigma on Nazism, on fascism, and so on. Now, of course, there is also the Serbian question, and the Serbs are now being bad kids, whipping boys. Yeah, that's a good word. Whipping boys of the Western media, mainstream media. And again, I mentioned, I guess you want to ask me the question about the neighboring Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a very, very sensitive place. And I guess we would probably need a whole semester talking about this. And Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, they're adjacent also, not very far from Albania and Kosovo. This is all the region. There is also a pretty large Muslim population. Now, this is European autochthon white population, but they are Muslims. They are not Turks, keep in mind. They are not Arabs. Of course, they're part and parcel of the Ottoman Empire until the Berlin Congress, 1873. And of course, they consider themselves Europeans, but they abide by those Muslim rules. Of course, they have certain interest in having good ties with Turkey. Keep in mind also that Kosovo Albanians, and of course the Albania proper, let alone 2.5 million Muslims living in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they have strong ties, and they sort of look for their identity. They cast their eyes towards Istanbul and Ankara, because keep in mind that Bosnia and Herzegovina was for 400 years part and parcel. It was like a golden jewel, white golden jewel. The best women, were taken from Bosnia and Herzegovina and married into the courts of the sultanates. So it's a long and complicated story, which unfortunately brings about very bad memories from people. I'm very pessimistic about the future of Bosnia and Herzegovina, because, of course, now it is supposed to serve as a model diversity state. But as you know very well, I know we can talk now about Australia. And this is my firm judgment, firm statement. I hope I will probably disagree with many of the viewers. Diversity never functions. Diversity always ends up in a civil war, in big wars. We witnessed Yugoslavia twice in the previous century, and witness what's going on now in the United States of America. Witness what's going on in Germany. There were large demonstrations yesterday in Leipzig. We can talk about this. And witness what's going on in Sweden. The country is getting more and more Balkanized. There's people taking their sides. Even you have implicit, not explicit, whites who are basically flocking to their herd, to their crowd, because for a variety of professional reasons or neighborhood reasons, they feel more safe with their blood and soil. I can put it that way. So again, Tim, I'm so sorry I'm ranting and rapping. And
do you think that
directions, but there's so many issues we need to cover here. And
Australians are in the dark, because Australia is being dragged into the affair in Ukraine, and a lot of people don't understand it. And obviously, they don't understand that this has resonance in the Balkans, as you've just pointed out, that there are parallels between what's happening in Kosovo and what's happening in eastern Ukraine. So you're actually helping to explain a lot of this very, very confusing thing. If Serbia, which, as you said, is a whipping boy, was to intervene militarily into Kosovo on ethnic grounds, do you think this would set off some form of European explosion?
Absolutely. Well, look, we read in history books that the First World War was ignited in Sarajevo in 1814. Keep in mind, 1814, Bosnia and Herzegovina was annexed by by Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it became a larger unit with neighboring Croatia, except for Serbia. Serbia was an independent kingdom. And of course, they had interest, and of course, they had very bad ties with Austria. In fact, they were quite hostile to Austria and Hungary, and they were quite friendly to the Tsarist court, the Tsarist Russia of Nicholas II, who was just prior to the First World War, during the Balkan Wars and so on. So, yes, indeed, you keep in mind that in terms of identity building process, Serbs have there are alma mater, we can say. There are spiritual guidance in Moscow, and going back, centuries and centuries. And of course, that's the reason that explains what I said earlier, that the government of Vucic and his entire crew is well, not explicit, but they're on very friendly terms with the Russian administration. Now, I just need to tell you that in Bosnia and Herzegovina, you have three major ethnic components. The largest, of course, are the Bosnian Muslims, who are pretty much a-national. We can say they're not particularly nationhood prone as far as building their identity as Bosniaks, which is it's not a good expression at all, and it's frequently used, but it doesn't mean very much. It's a newly crafted word, Bosnians or Bosniaks. And of course, keeping in mind, as I said again, that they have a certain nostalgia for the Ottoman Empire. And when you see, for instance, just to illustrate that, when the Turkish soccer crew comes to Sarajevo, and when they play against the local Croatian club or whatever, and you see the Turkish flags on display. So I'm not ruling out that the Serbs, the Turks, and it's huge. It's a country with 80 million citizens. It's a major NATO country, with a large Eastern Mediterranean country. They have their interest, but with their old imperial ambitions. And I'm not ruling out that they will certainly play a very important role in case of a major conflict here. Now, they make 2.5 million in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Of course, they speak more or less the same language as the Croats and then as the Serbs. Then you have 1.5 million Serbs in Republika Srpska. Republika Srpska is located right nearby, right near Croatia, in the northern part along the Sava River. Very important area, about, I'll tell you, less than 60 miles to Hungary. Now, irony of history, Mr. Orban, who I respect his realistic policy, has good ties with Serbia and good ties also with the Republika Srpska, and he has also good ties, also like a Serbian government with Russia. Well, neutral. He doesn't want to completely follow the ukazes and the game of the European Union. Hence the reason he is constantly being attacked in the Western media. Orban, and the Prime Minister of Hungary. So again, this is a very sensitive area. We're not talking about Australia. Australia is like the United States of America, 3 times or 4 times the size of the European Union. We're talking about literally a size of a region that you can take a bicycle and you can bicycle from let's say Republika Srpska across the river of Sava, and in more than 3 or 4 hours, you're already on the Hungarian border. Well, there are no borders now because we're in the European Union, so it's really close by. We have the expression, it's a little vulgar, but I'm not going to say it. When something happens here, when somebody farts here in Croatia, you can see the smell. You can hear the smell anywhere else, somewhere else in the vicinity. So yes, the Serbs have their quasi-autonomy, Republika Srpska. They have a big man, Dodik, who is not beloved at all in the United States and who is not beloved by the European Union. Just last week, 2 weeks ago, he traveled to Moscow, had a very cordial encounter with Mr. Putin. So this is just a tentative scenario. Please, I'm not into this crystal ball or card reading or tarot, you call it whichever way you wish. But in case of a major crisis, diplomatic crisis. I'm not ruling out that the Russian diplomacy or Russian military, for that matter, can use the card not just of the Serbia proper, but of the Serbian community of Republika Srpska and Bosnia proper, which doesn't have exit to the sea, but it's an important, very important enclave nonetheless. It's like the size of Slovenia, like less than Rhode Island side. It's 10,000 square miles, about 15 square miles, but it's nonetheless very homogeneous. Serbs basically live there. Of course, there are some Croats left, some leftovers. There are also some leftovers from Bosnian, from Muslim Bosniaks. But it's pretty homogeneous. They have their own army. They have their own paramilitary. I presume they also get logistics from Belgrade proper. And of course, in terms of their identity, they identify themselves as Serbs. And they are the ones who are in the forefront of fusing, of actually annexing themselves, what's the better words, of becoming part and parcel of Greater Serbia, if you can follow me there.
Yep.
It's a little bit sketch of the land. It's not very, it looks a little bit funny, but nonetheless, there is a corridor going along the Sava River all the way to Serbia proper. So I'm not ruling out that, again, forget about Croatia and the war between Serbs and Croats. Again, it can be ignited, but it's just a tentative scenario because, of course, Croatia proper now, well, it's not officially an American military base, but there are frequent exercises, whatever military things going on. And there were recently two big ships, aircraft carriers, who entered into the split, and Croatia has a large coast, beautiful coast. It's a summer season also. Everybody's skinny dipping, everybody is enjoying himself. But next day, you never know what happens, So yes, indeed, Croatia now plays a very important part, and I need to underline that, in the NATO and the EU security arrangements, as opposed to Serbia, which is more inclined towards Russia. So again, nobody knows what will happen.
I'll ask you, Tom. I've been distributing your book, Homo Americanus, and quite a number. We have a little reading library here at our office, and many people have picked up your book. This is actually the one you signed for me back in 2007. So it's certainly done the rounds of many people. Do you think that a lot of Europeans, particularly those in Eastern Europe, don't really understand what the United States is?
You are quite right. I guess I wrote about this in this book, Homo Americanus. And by the way, there is a new edition published by Arctos with a nice preface by, of course, Kevin MacDonald, and a nice postface by Alain de Benoit, which I translated from French into English. It's much better. It's more polished because there were some typos in this edition that you have. And I think I'm quite proud of this book because I put quite a bit of effort in it. Homo Americanus, Strive of the Postmodern Age. Again, we are talking here about the major theme of identity. You can keep in mind that during the Cold War, America was was conceived by many East European anti-communists, but mostly lots of people, as the only haven of free speech, is the only haven of free expression. And of course, I was raised in an anti-communist family. We all looked up to J.F. Kennedy. We looked up to Nixon, was our favorite. And unlike many West European scholars, myself, I remember we're applauding when the Americans were bombing the Viet Congs and the communists down there, because it was genetic in my family that we were anti-communist by definition. However, keep in mind, we are no longer in the Cold War. It's a different ballgame.
That's right.
The profile of the administration of Biden, look even at the ethnic profile, we're not going to be too explicit, of people in his cabinet and the major agencies controlled by Biden's people, and you will know exactly. And most, quite a few of them come from this area of Eastern Ukraine and Western Russia. You know who I have in mind. His officials like Blinken, not just him, but quite a few of people in the State Department. Their grandparents come from Eastern Russia, from the Pale of Settlement. Yes, and of course in the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, and so on. And all folks from basically whose origins can be traced to eastern Ukraine and western Russia. And I suspect even this lady Nuland, Victoria Nuland, which I don't think is very much of a good politician, he pursues this policy. You notice that even in her remarks 10 years or 15 years back when she was talking very critically about the Europeans and Russians. And I guess they probably, I'm just taking a wild guess, they have the historical beef against the Russians, given the fact that many Jews indeed suffered on Russian pogroms and persecutions, and of course. So again, you have to take all those details into account if you want to come up with some decent academic assessment of what's going on, specifically in Eastern Ukraine and Russia, or for that matter, even in the Balkans. I frankly, again, as I said, don't just consider Russia as an important factor. Here's the United States of America. They have over 1,000. Well, I don't want to, but officially they have over 140 military bases all over the world, but it's more than that. They have security arrangements in virtually every country on Earth, from Diego Garcia Islands all the way to Samoa Islands, not nearby, but you have Samoans. And then in the Pacific Basin, and of course in Central Europe as well. And Lithuania and the Baltic countries and Poland, Romania, they're also members. Romania and Bulgaria also members of NATO. And Romania is quite an important chunk of the Balkans, not very far from where we live here, about 600 miles. And of course, they have some bases stationed there, which is right in the very vicinity of Moldova and very vicinity of Russia. So if you look at Russia is being more encircled by quote unquote by the American troops security arrangements than is the case with the United States of America. Mexico is not a threat to Canada, is not a threat to the United States of America, and I don't see any foreign base other than Cuba. We can look at Cuba, but I don't think that Cuba represents any serious threat. But then again, as I said, let's focus a little bit again, real briefly. I'll recap. Bosnia and Herzegovina, given the fact that Republika Srpska, despite the fact that it sits in a Bosnian jurisdiction, it has its own separate diplomacy. It has very good ties with the Putin's court, let alone Serbia proper, which is very much a spiritual donor, spiritual mentor, so to speak, of Republika Srpska, which has good ties also with Putin's court. So again, under this impossible, who knows, probably possible scenario, I'm not ruling out that the Russians may use this card if the war breaks out, if something ugly happens. And of course, the poor Europeans, as it always is, will again be involved in stupid civil wars, because here I must make some critical statements. Please do allow me that. And I know I don't have many friends among European nationalists who are too much obsessed with our historical myths, which are to some extent true. I mean, with all due respects I have for the Poles, with all due respects I have for the Germans' claims for Danzig and of Pomerania and Silesia, and I know very well what happened to German ethnic Germans after the Second War. I know it firsthand because I'm a member of the Bunderdeutschen in Croatia, and the Association of Germans in Croatia. So I know very well the plight they went through after the Second War, from Crimea to Kazakhstan all the way to Prussia or the Poland and so on. But again, getting involved in this never-ending, everlasting bickering and hatreds like Serbs against Croats, Ukrainians against Russians, Poles against the Russians, and it's you have to ask yourself a question, a standard question, and you don't need to have a PhD for it. Who benefits from it? We're just killing each other, whacking each other, just like this thing. I mean, look, this is no secret. There are quite a few Croatians. I know even some of them fighting in the Azov battalion. Even we had them as guests 5 or 6 years back here in Croatia. Of course, they were not darlings. They were whipping boys back then. But now they are being honored. They are being praised even by the Croatian press. I'm talking the mainstream press. And you feel sort of sorry for them. There are some Swedes also I know who are fighting in the Azov battalion. Of course, keep in mind Canada has a very large Ukrainian population who obtained Canadian citizenship after the Second War, and they're quite prominent in not in Trudeau's administration, but I'm pretty much sure they're putting some pressure. I know it firsthand from the Ukrainian lobbies. The former ambassador, whom I knew briefly in Croatia about 5 or 4 years back, was a Canadian of Ukrainian origin. So I don't know where he's right now. He probably may have been transferred somewhere else. But something tells me that he's more inclined to Ukrainians and whatever than to Russians. So again, these are all the issues we have to take into account. But I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to tell you that even some of my colleagues from France who are married to Ukrainian women, good women, like nice-looking women, whatever, they've, of course, taken the sides of the Ukrainian nationalists, banderistas, as opposed to the Russians who have their own, possibly volunteers from Serbia and Greece, possibly Macedonia. And I guess I don't like this scenario because I always ask a stupid question, rhetorical question. It certainly doesn't help us. It helps non-European powers. It helps those who hate European heritage. It helps those. It actually boosts the narrative of those who are actually opposed to our heritage.
Well, Tom, let me ask you the toxic question. Why don't these people see this? Why don't they see that the forces that they're fighting for are forces that seek to destroy their heritages in their own countries?
Again, that's a good question, and I could raise the same question as far as the Serbs and Croats are concerned. Let me tell you, I'll put it somewhat graphically. I have lots of friends who are sort of qualified as nationalists. I mean, people know me in Zagreb, although I'm not too much of a loner. I keep it in my books and so on. Yesterday, I was with some very prominent folks. I was with the General Glasnovic, who is a good friend of mine. You probably know him. He's a very good guy. We worked together in Australia. Kevin McDonald some time ago. He's a great guy. He's a Canadian. He's a kind of Canadian Croat. His mother tongue is actually both Croatian and English, or American English. And yes, indeed, I guess that's where we differ. I must say that quite openly. We differ in our stance towards Serbia. He is much more anti-Serb in the sense that he has, very legitimate reasons to have to be opposed to engage in this anti-Serb rhetoric, because look, what happened to his brother, and what happened, when he was captured by Serbs. I don't want to go into graphic details. And there are many, many Croats indeed who suffered big time, in the Serb uprising. It was not just the Serb uprising, it was also the communist onslaught on Croatia. So again, things are highly, highly complicated. But again, let me illustrate it with another thing. I talked sometimes to Polish nationalists. We agree on all issues. They're also afraid of being swamped by quote-unquote diversity, non-European migrants. They don't have that as many, of course, as for instance, Western Europe, because Eastern Europe is still very homogeneous in terms of ethnicity and racial profile. But they still harbor those sentiments against the Germans, against not probably as strong as they used to be. The Czechs also have their beefs against the Slovaks, let alone, as we see it on the daily basis, Serbs and Croats. Despite the war being over, despite this terrible war, but I'm sometimes surprised by the fact that many Croats do not see that we are changed, that we are literally, not metaphorically, being replaced by non-Europeans. So I ask myself on the daily basis a question: why should I now harbor? What's the better expression? Why should I now boost my anti-Serbian rhetoric and use those anti-Serbian speeches while at the same time being literally removed from our gene pool? Is literally, I don't want to sound like a big-time sociobiologist, but let me illustrate again. I was yesterday in Zagreb. I spent quite some time with some very prominent lawyer from the United States of America, good friends of mine. He's a member of the Charles Martel Society. He's now touring the Balkans, very prominent lawyer. And I noticed, and I was surprised because I don't go that often downtown. It's a beautiful Baroque place, all clean, fantastic, good women walking around, people sipping their coffee. But I noticed that there are more and more, especially from the Nepalese of Nepal, and from the Pakistan, there are more and more foreigners, aliens, you want to put it that way, especially in the way this menial work, like what they call Uber or
Eats, yeah.
pizzas in the department and in apartments and bicycling around. And I noticed that. I mean, in the major town squares, you notice quite a few folks who are, I mean, by their looks, by their profile, by their phenotypes, they're either from Southern Pacific. I should say they're of smaller stature. I guess for the Philippines, you can say that. Now, Philippines, of course, are very Catholic, so that they can better integrate than, let's say, folks from Thailand, or for that matter. There are quite a few, and of course, you can make a distinction between the Chinese and Japanese tourists. There are quite a few of Zagreb in Zagreb. Now, again, when you compare Croatia, even Zagreb proper, it's a big urban center, to Vienna, it's still like a heaven. It's like it's still very white, very European. Very generic and Nordic, whichever way you want to put it, and but it's different. It's quite different from what it was like 2 or 3 years back, because now with Croatia being part and parcel of the European Union, that's important. Being part and parcel of the Schengen Agreement, it's quite important. Schengen Agreement, Croatia joined the Schengen Agreement 1st of January this year, which means literally now we use the euro currencies. You travel now, you can go to Denmark and Sweden, any place you want to, without your passport. You just need to have, no, you don't even need an ID. You can just sit in your car and your driver's license and walk around whichever way you like. Mm-hmm. However, the Schengen Agreement means that Croatia is now literally, not metaphorically, literally in the forefront. It's the first country it's in the forefront of being a platform for the arrival of, as they call them, refugees, euphemistically, that's a bad word, migrants on the Balkan route, coming from Asia, from Central Asia, from Turkey, and from Syria and elsewhere. Now, keep in mind another aside that I got to also underline: 3.5 million. Remind that 3.5 million migrants reside as of now in Turkey proper. And you know what Erdogan, the big man, the big chief of Turkey, said the other day, that he said it on many occasions, in terms of problems with the European Union, we'll just release those people and let them travel to Europe. Yes. So again, Croatia is now literally in the forefront of this. I'm sorry.
Do you think that the immigration question and what you call then replacement questions are issues that might actually help to snap, to use your description, some Europeans out of this fratricidal attitude, one to the other, the bickering aspect, one to the other?
I think I was probably not explicit enough. Nationalism, the way we observed it, the way we witnessed it in the First World War and during the Second World War, is something harmful. And I'm very adamant about this. I'm very, very opposed to it, unlike many of my Croatian colleagues, unlike some of my French colleagues, or for that matter, German colleagues. I don't like it. It was harmful. We cannot just blame the proverbial Jews or proverbial Muslims or proverbial liberals or proverbial Freemasons for our problems. Let's just put another rhetorical question, or rather, my statement. Even if Europe, or for that matter Australia is a different ballgame. We are much better off in terms of this homogeneity. But even if all miraculously all those aliens disappeared from Europe, I doubt that we would live in a very peaceful society, because unfortunately those myths, those nationalist and those cultural myths, which we sometimes very much like bragging about and how proud we are of Croatian culture and so on, But this Croatian culture, this Croatian mythology, it's always at the expense of the Serbs or that matter Muslims, which of course I'm proud of the Croatian heritage, the Croatian language. My mom comes from the island of Krk. The Krk is a symbolic historical place because the Croatian tablet, Baška tablet, was discovered there, going back to the Croatian kingdom where the name of Croatia is mentioned and so on. We're talking about the 12th century, 13th century, going back even earlier, the king of Tomislav, 9th century. I'm proud of it, but not at the expense of foreign nations, of adjacent nations. Unfortunately, we've been engaged in this petty nationalist struggles ever since when do we start? Since French Revolution and I guess we saw the climax of it during the Second World War. It was not just the war against communism. I wish it had only been the war against communism, then I would have chosen the sides. But it was unfortunately also the war between Poles and Serbs, and the Poles and Germans, the Serbs, Croats, and so on, which of course in the eyes of an American GI or let's say soldier from New Zealand or Canada may sometimes look strange and bizarre. Even when I talk to my friends in America, they're aware of this problem. It's a festering problem, and we can see it. Unfortunately, again now, people dying by thousands in eastern Ukraine. The best blood, the Ukrainian blood and the Russian blood, again, so this is a pessimistic answer I can give to Jim at this stage. And
I know it's necessary. I know your time is precious tonight, Tom, for various reasons. So I'll ask you, if I may, a final question, if that's all right with you. I'd ask you, do you think that there is, amongst your European contacts and other European groups, a desire now to see through some of this and in favour of a different model of European cooperation outside of the EU and the United States dictated models? Do you think there's a new attempt to redefine the idea of an eternal European identity or something along those lines? What do you feel?
Can you rephrase it, Jim? I'm sorry, in a simple way, because I didn't quite follow. I guess.
Okay.
As I understand, this is the unity. Are you talking about the European unity?
The essential unity and identity of a type of eternal European civilization and culture, as opposed to the fake culture that's coming out of the current USA. Do you think that there's some potential for a new model for Europeans that's different to the European Union model of what constitutes European values?
Yes, absolutely, I agree with you. Now, of course, when you talk about the model, you always have to have a modeler. You have to have a model, a role model. You have to have somebody who is what the Germans call Ordnungsmacht, the power that makes order. Now, which power do we have in mind? I mean, I was once a big fan of the Holy German Empire, of Charles. But it's highly impossible at this stage. I would certainly like to see the Germans play a stronger role, a more efficient role in terms of providing us not just with a political, or for that matter, geopolitical vector, but also as a cultural vector. But look, the Germans are a servile, very scared, a self-hating nation. Look how they behave. They behave more American, in a more Americanized fashion than the Americans themselves. They have to do their penance in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, literally let's say, on a monthly basis. They have to expiate their sins. So Germans are in a poor position. As far as the French are concerned, also keep in mind, I admire the French language and I'm very proud of mastering it very, very well. But the French are not, particularly in Central Europe, the French, they have this image, which I'm presuming this is also the case in Australia, as good cheese eaters, as good, good women, you can court and so on. But the folks in Central and Eastern Europe specifically know very little about France and the French French cultural endeavor. Now, I certainly wouldn't mind seeing more of a unity between the French and the Germans, but at this stage, I don't see this happen. Now, of course, here comes the the Russian card. Look, we are all fond of Solzhenitsyn. I read Solzhenitsyn. We know Dostoevsky was a very visionary man. I'm sure you read his book, The Double, Dvoinik in Russian, right? The Idiot. I mean, it's a very visionary.
Yeah.
And I certainly wouldn't mind having the Russians play a very prominent role. But then again, there's still, again, it may sound as a shock to you and to many Australians, despite the fact that we are the vicinity. Many East Europeans and many West Europeans do not quite identify themselves with the Russians as Europeans. There are lots of, even my colleagues, even scholars, who observe the Russians as a semi-European, semi-Asian type of a cultural force. I know a little bit, I certainly know more about Russia and the Russian history, and of course the great Russian authors, Alexander Zinoviev, I grew up with, and Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn, Vladimir Bukovsky, and so on. I was groomed in anti-communism based on their literature. And but then again, to many Europeans, they look at them as an alien force, let alone that there are still those residues of communism. So many, even some intelligent folks, and I sometimes argue with them, they think that Putin is a replica. It's rather a follow-up on the Soviet endeavor, which is not true. I mean, after all, Putin had good ties with Solzhenitsyn, and he made some very good anti-communist statements. But then again, you just have to look at the perception of not of Tom Sunic, but of people who live here and talk to them. So again, at this stage, I don't see any model. However, having said it, doesn't mean that we have to be pessimistic. I hate to say that. We need a role model. We need a leader. But at this stage, even quote unquote in our right wing, in our nationalist circles, I don't see a specific man who could provide me with some good ideas, who could actually take up all those challenges, be it in France or in Germany. I'm surprised. And really, the same thing goes for Germany. I spoke yesterday with this lawyer, a great friend of mine. I'll be visiting him soon in Dallas. And he told me exactly the same thing. There's so many groups of nationalists, right wings, whatever. But again, we have a problem with this character issue. Everybody wants to be a leader. Everybody wants to be a little Führer. Nobody wants to be a sub-Führer. So I guess that's the issue we have to come to terms with. I guess the unity for me means first and foremost, getting immersed into our neighborhood literature, to the literature and mythology of our neighbors, of the Serbs. I read Serbian authors quite often. There's some great authors that I'm familiar with. And not just shrug them off and not just, as we say, piss them off like this and start demonizing them. And again, I'm leaving you. I have no particular political ambitions, but I usually in my speeches, and hopefully also in Australia, I would like to provide some, not formulas, not mathematical formulas, how we can actually bridge those gaps. Because again, I have to repeat it again. I don't want to bother you with those slogans. We are dying. Our European heritage, regardless whether your European heritage is from Romania or from Crimea, or for that matter, even there were Europeans living in Afghanistan, for that matter. I don't know if you're familiar with their racial profile. Some areas, and even in Kazakhstan, they had a large German community in Kazakhstan during Katarina the Great. Still, I spoke with a lady, blonde, Aryan looking. She was born in Kazakhstan, Soviet Kazakhstan, when it was still a republic. So again, albeit in Argentina, there are good Europeans living in Argentina, lots of them, lots of Croats living there. I know lots of Croats and lots of French and lots of Germans in Brazil and so on. So we just got to resuscitate, revive our European heritage, but not at the expense of hatred of other nations.
Right.
That's what I keep saying. And I guess this petty nationalist tribal issues, this is I would suggest to your listeners, if you don't mind, we will, and I'm sorry if I get a little bit carried away. Let's just focus on our common grounds, like on our Homer, on our Iliad, on our literature, on our cultural memory, and let's forget those tribal issues which certainly do not serve that kill us. This is a suicidal type of a policy, because otherwise we'll disappear.
Well, Tom, I know your time, and if I may, perhaps if we wind up now, and I'd like to repeat that when we work out the technical details of your coming to Australia, I, for one, will make sure that your tour is well advertised, and we're going to do our level best to make sure it's a complete success. So thank you very much for tonight, and I look forward to speaking to you in person in Sydney in many months' time. And,
thank you very much. I'm working on. I will get this with the lady. I'm sure you know
yes,
her name.
I know.
I'll get this thing taken care of. It's technical nature, but again, as I said, I will tell you. Certainly, you will hear from me shortly as far as this is concerned.
Thank
All
you.
what I'm looking forward to is just a decent crowd, decent people. I'm not into any big time honoraria or whatever. I'm not. I just want to see decent people. They don't have to be necessarily academics. Just normal, decent people have a good sense of respect and civility, and no radicals, please. And we're not into that. We don't want to go with some Nazi insignia. It's a non-starter.
No, well, that won't be happening. We'll be making
This
sure
is a
that
non-starter. It won't get you anywhere. And let's just deal. And I would be very pleased to talk about. I'm dealing with this issue of modern and ancient myths. I'm dealing now with very extensively with. My piece just came out, and now Marx, Moses, and Pagans in the Secular City just came out in the Occidental Observer. It was published in 1904 in a very prestigious journal. Now it was reposted with a short intro in the Occidental Observer. I'm very proud of it. It's a heavily footnoted, so have a look at it and please spread it around. And I'm at your service. And good night, or good morning.
Okay,
And have
good
a
night,
nice
Tom.
day. And I'm at your service, Jim.
Thank you very much, Tom. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.